Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another forecast discussion. We are on the heels of yesterday's severe weather event across the plains into the Midwest that thankfully did not go quite as planned. There were still quite a few severe thunderstorms from places like Iowa all the way down into Oklahoma and Texas, but thankfully very little tornadic activity in what was a pretty volatile environment. So thankfully the event underperformed on the tornadic side of things, and that is a very good thing for the folks in these regions. But we have more severe weather on the way, and that is going to be in the form of a multi-day stretch of severe potential starting Saturday and going through at least the early portion of next week. The SPC has outlined multiple days of severe potential on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, with the chance to add more severe weather risk areas to days beyond that Monday time frame. So we have a prolonged stretch of severe potential that is going to begin this weekend, going into the early and perhaps middle portion of next week. Here's what the outlooks are showing right now. The SPC has outlined a slight risk level 2 out of 5 for the day 3 outlook. That is on Saturday for basically much of West Texas. Amarillo, Lubbock, Midland, Odessa under the gun for that level 2 out of 5 risk on Saturday. Stretches basically from the Texas-New Mexico border eastward to the Texas South Plains down into almost getting into the Abilene area, but not quite. Large marginal risk surrounding that up toward the Kansas-Nebraska border into the western half of Oklahoma and down into central Texas and eastern New Mexico. But that main risk for Saturday going to be in the yellow shaded region there in that level 2 out of 5 risk. Then we go into the day 4 through 8 outlook, and for the day 4 outlook on Sunday, the SPC has outlined a risk area from central Nebraska southward through Kansas, Oklahoma, and into North Texas, including places like Wichita down toward Oklahoma City, and just stretching short of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, but we could see adjustments, and we likely will see adjustments in the coming days for who's in and who's out. So DFW Metroplex definitely needs to be on alert for Sunday just in case. But for now, that risk extends from basically the Abilene area of west central Texas through much of western Oklahoma, central Kansas, and southern Nebraska. Then we have a risk area on Monday as well. Doesn't shift all that much to the east, but now Dallas-Fort Worth and Waco firmly within that slight risk on Monday. That still does include the OKC metro area and the Tulsa area up toward Kansas City under the gun for Monday. And then we don't have any risk areas out for day 6 and beyond, but we do have the possibility that risks will be added in future outlooks. So this event could stretch well beyond the Monday time frame and going into the middle portion of next week. But for now, we have outlooks that have explicitly been added for Saturday, Sunday, and Monday from the southern high plains northeastward into the central and southern plains and parts of the Midwest. We also are going to have a heavy rain threat with this system. Lots of folks going to be under the gun for very heavy rainfall and flash flooding. The WPC Weather Prediction Center has outlined multiple elevated risk areas starting tomorrow, Friday, going through at least early next week. This is the next few days. This is Friday, Saturday, Sunday. That looks to be perhaps the most potent of the next few days as far as rainfall goes. This is a 4-tier scale, so unlike the SPC scale, that has 5 scales, 5 for the severe, or 5 categories for the severe threat: marginal, slight, enhanced, moderate, high. The WPC excessive rainfall outlooks only have 4 categories: marginal, slight, moderate, and high. But they basically mean the same thing, and you can see down here what those categories mean. Moderate risk here out for Sunday from basically southwest Oklahoma into southeast Kansas, including the OKC metro area and up toward the Tulsa and kind of the Wichita areas as well. That is at least a 40% chance in the moderate risk area, that red shaded region there, that rainfall will exceed flash flood guidance within 25 miles of a point. So basically, a very elevated chance of excessive rainfall that could lead to significant flash flooding impacts within that moderate risk area. Marginal and slight risk extend out from that. Again, this is for Sunday morning in through Monday morning. And then we go to Monday, we have a slight risk pushing off to the northeast a little bit. So multiple days of heavy rain and flash flooding potential starting really tomorrow across parts of southeast New Mexico, and then shifting northeast with time into the plains and Midwest by early next week. So heavy rainfall, flash flooding going to be a significant threat with this upcoming system. But we're going to focus on the severe threat in this video, so let's go ahead and dive into that. First, let's take a look at what's going on currently across the U.S. We'll look at some SPC mesoanalysis data. This is at 500 millibars, and you'll see this trough over the Great Lakes region. That was our main driving factor for our severe weather event yesterday through the southern and central plains into the Midwest. That will continue to move off to the northeast pretty quickly and will be out of the picture, and we won't have to worry about it here in the U.S. as far as severe weather goes here going forward. But you do see this trough starting to build in across the Pacific Northwest. That is our next weather system, and that will be our main driving force for the severe weather threat coming up over the next several days. It will really start to dig down into the desert southwest, and it will make a very slow eastward progress through this weekend into the early portion of next week. And that's why we're going to see a prolonged stretch, a multi-day stretch of severe weather with this trough. We'll see it won't really eject into the plains until Monday or Tuesday. And that's when we'll start to see that severe threat shift off to the east, but a little bit unclear how that's going to progress at this point. That's why the SPC has not added risk areas for Tuesday and beyond yet, but we probably will see some semblance of risk areas added in future outlook cycles. But what we do know is that this trough is going to be a pretty high amplitude, pretty potent trough, and it will dig down pretty handily into the desert southwest and be our main driving force for severe weather going through this upcoming stretch. Down at the surface, not a whole lot going on after yesterday's event. We see that surface low up in the Great Lakes region. We've had some snow up here on the backside of this surface low. We didn't really have a very potent surface low yesterday, but it has since really started to take shape as it has moved into the Great Lakes region, with that trough starting to become more compact and really negatively tilted, and thus we've seen a very very nice surface cyclogenesis in this region today. But again, that will move out pretty quickly. Surface high pressure ridge behind that with our cold front that has pushed off into the southeast and into deep South Texas. And that has pushed off much of our moisture, but it's not going to push it off too much. This is our current surface data. So we can see where this cold front is. You see northerly flow across much of the plains into northern and central Texas through at current time. That is on the backside of the cold front, but it's not super cold air. Temperatures only in the low to mid 60s here across much of Oklahoma, down into the 70s there, going toward the Red River and southward. We're still in the 70s and 80s even behind the cold front here in central Texas. So it's not a very robust fast-moving cold front. If we had, very cold air behind the cold front, we would probably see this really start to surge and wipe that moisture well into the Gulf, which would be of a factor that might negate some of the severe threat, at least early on, as this next trough would come in. But that's not going to be the case. We're not going to see a full sweeping of the moisture out into the Gulf. We're going to see moisture maintain itself here across South Texas. You can see 70s dew points still in place across much of South Texas, mid 60s dew points as well over toward the Del Rio area there. And that's not going to change all that much going into the next couple of days. We're going to see this reservoir of moisture maintain itself, and so it's not going to be too far, not going to take too much to get that moisture all the way up into the severe weather threat areas for this weekend threat. So that is one positive for severe weather in this case, is that we're not going to have what appear to be moisture issues, at least at the surface, at least issues in getting the moisture into the areas of interest for Saturday and beyond. That reservoir of moisture is going to be nicely situated there in Texas, ready to be pulled northward as we start to see that trough move in and the response at the surface. Those winds are going to flip around to southerly pretty quickly over the next few days. As this trough starts to dig down into the desert southwest, we'll see those winds flip around and start transporting that moisture northward pretty rapidly for the start of the severe weather stretch on Saturday. So as we always do with these outlooks, these videos that are a few days out, what I like to do is go through a few different models, and that's just to kind of compare and contrast what each model is showing, to give us a plethora of solutions of what might happen with this upcoming stretch. We're going to go day by day. We're going to take a look at Saturday, then Sunday, then Monday, and then we'll touch on beyond that toward the end. We're going to use three different models, as we always do. We're going to use the 12Z NAM, the 12Z GFS, and the 12Z European model. So all of our morning model runs for our three main models here for what we use to forecast. So we'll start off with the NAM. We'll go forward in time as we'll set the stage here at 500 millibars. Here is that trough that was yesterday's weather maker, and here's our new trough that is starting to dig down into the Pacific Northwest, and that will be our main driver for the next stretch of severe weather. So you see over the next few days that trough moves off into the northeast and gets out of the way pretty quickly, and we see this wave start to dig down into the west coast by Saturday. So this is Saturday. We see just kind of broad southwest flow across much of the plains. We see most of the flow is still relegated to the backside of this trough. The axis of the trough is right in here toward the Great Basin region up into the Idaho, Washington, Oregon border region there down into the Colorado River Valley. So that trough is still situated well off here, and our main flow is still relegated well to the backside of this trough. That means it's a maturing trough, and that means it will continue to dig down into the desert southwest. But out ahead of that, for at least the initial portion of the event on Saturday, we're going to see just broad southwesterly flow out here across the central and southern high plains. That means we're going to have to rely more on little shortwave impulses rotating through the flow to initiate severe storms, at least on a localized sense. So let's take a look at that. At 500 millibars, we don't see a whole lot here. Maybe some slightly enhanced areas of flow within this main just belt of broad southwesterly flow. One in here across the Texas Panhandle, but we don't really see any curvature with that particular potential shortwave. Let's go down to 700 millibars and see what we see here. So I'll back it up to 12Z on Saturday, and let's see if we see anything. We might see a little bit of something down in here across the West Texas region, sort of the Big Bend region of Texas moving in, but it seems to be pretty much just broad southwesterly flow here. We might have to look a little bit more deeply and kind of wait and see how things play out going into the Saturday timeframe to see if we have any more any of these impulses rotating through to really focus that severe threat, but not really seeing much at this point. So we may also have to rely on terrain. Of course, we have the Caprock here in the Texas Panhandle region, so that may help things out as well, especially if the surface flow is nice and southeasterly. We'll take a look at that in a second. But we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. Not seeing a whole lot in the way of shortwaves moving through, so we may have to rely on surface features and terrain to get the job done here on Saturday. We'll go back to 500 millibars here, and let's take a look at what the GFS solution is showing. Much of the same here. That initial trough moves off into eastern Canada and into the northeast, and that secondary trough makes its way down into the desert southwest and west coast by Saturday afternoon. A very similar solution to what the NAM was showing, just a broad belt of southwesterly flow here out ahead of the axis of this trough, and most of that stronger flow, all of the stronger flow, relegated to the backside of the trough axis. So just a broad belt of southwesterly flow here out across the central and southern high plains for Saturday. Very similar solution to what the NAM was showing here. So we're pretty much on the same page among these models for the 500 millibar trough. How about the European model? See much of the same here as well. And if we go to 0Z on Sunday, so 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time on Saturday, much of the same. Broad southwesterly flow out here across the central to southern high plains. Not a big difference here overall in between these models. They're all showing a very high amplitude trough that will continue to get higher in amplitude, but just a broad belt of southwesterly flow here out across this region. GFS, let's see if it's showing any more little defined shortwaves here. And we are kind of picking up on this little bit of curvature here by Saturday afternoon across the West Texas, Southeast New Mexico corridor that could be of assistance in being just enough to help initiate storms in this environment out across the West Texas region there. So that is something that the NAM was kind of showing and the GFS is showing as well. Let's see if the European model has that same thing. And the Euro model, not really showing anything robust here. We do see a little bit of stronger flow out here across this region with maybe just a tiny bit of curvature there. So it looks like we are kind of on the same page as far as maybe a little bit of a shortwave coming through Saturday afternoon into Saturday evening. Let's go down to the surface here. Again, I don't want to go too much into detail with these setups yet because we're still several days out, so we just don't know how things are going to evolve exactly yet. But we can at least get a decent picture here. But let's take a look at the surface data. Just take a look at the broad pattern here. So that surface low associated with this initial trough moves out. Surface high pressure ridge here across the plains going to be replaced by and this northerly flow going to be replaced pretty quickly by nice southerly and southeasterly flow. You see by tomorrow afternoon, this is 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time tomorrow, we have already seen a transition to more southerly and southeasterly flow across Texas. So a very quick transition from northerly to southeasterly and southerly winds to help start pumping that moisture northward tomorrow. So moisture transport should not be an issue with this particular setup. We should have plenty of moisture, given that it's just situated there across central and southern Texas right now. Not going to take a lot to pull that moisture northward into West Texas for Saturday, and so low-level moisture should not be a concern for Saturday. You can see going into Saturday, not really much in the way of surface low development here. We do have a southwesterly flow aloft traversing the higher terrain of the Rockies out here, but not much in the way of surface low development. This is on the Euro model. Let's take a look at the GFS down at the surface as well. So this is the GFS, and you see very quick transition to more southerly flow out here by tomorrow. Almost by late morning to midday tomorrow, we'll start to see southerly flow pumping that moisture northward. And then going into Saturday, not much in the way of surface low development here, maybe a little bit of a surface low starting to develop across eastern Colorado, but we do have broad southerly flow across this region, but not much in the way of a strong surface low down here that we typically see with a bigger type of severe weather setup. How about the NAM for Saturday at the surface? So much of the same here, quick transition to more southerly flow, and we see maybe a little bit of a weak surface low developing there in eastern Colorado, not much in the southern plains. So not much of an organization to this overall surface pattern here. So that leads a little bit of uncertainty to where storms may fire here. They may be tied mostly to the higher terrain areas, maybe initiating in eastern New Mexico on the higher terrain there, as well as maybe the Caprock could be potential foci for severe storm development on Saturday. But let's take a look at some moisture. The good news for Saturday, at least from a forecasting perspective, all the models are pretty much on the same page with what is going to happen as far as the background pattern goes for Saturday's event. So how about the moisture here? Let's take a look at the NAM. We see that reservoir of moisture does not, that cold front kind of stalls out here this evening into the southeast and east Texas corridor. And so, and we still have very rich moisture to the south of that. We're going to be easily pulled to the north starting tomorrow morning into midday, and we'll get those 60s dew points by 12Z Saturday. So 7 a.m. Central Daylight Time Saturday, already 60s dew points up into western Oklahoma, southern Texas Panhandle into eastern New Mexico. So plenty of moisture return here. We know the higher terrain areas of West Texas into eastern New Mexico. We don't need as much moisture as we would on the lower plains because air at higher altitudes holds less moisture. So a 60 dew point here in eastern New Mexico, West Texas, is like a 65, 67 dew point out here in, say, Oklahoma City. So robust moisture for these higher terrain regions. We do start to see some mixing here potentially going on into eastern New Mexico. We see those dew points drop a little bit into the low to mid 50s here. But we do have 60s dew points basically from the central Texas Panhandle, maybe Amarillo southward and southwestward toward the New Mexico-Texas border there. Not a very well-defined dry line per se. Dry line might be out in here well to the west with a little bit of a moisture gradient here, perhaps very not a very tight moisture gradient, but maybe one out in there. So that could be a potential boundary to focus storms as well, but somewhat of a disorganized surface pattern for Saturday, and that makes me think these severe threats going to remain on the lower side perhaps. And because things usually with these setups that don't really have a well-defined surface pattern, you just don't see robust severe weather. You need the robust surface features to really focus severe storms and give areas that have a greater severe threat over others. So not really seeing that here, but we do have a moist air mass in place with some perhaps shortwave energy moving through at this point Saturday afternoon. Could be enough to initiate some more perhaps scattered convection, not really well-organized convection. We should have strong shear given strong flow aloft, but maybe just a lot of storms out here, multiple rounds of storms perhaps out here in this corridor without much real organization to them per se. So that is 4 p.m. Saturday, 7 p.m. Saturday, still kind of the same thing there. And as we go into nighttime hours, we'll continue to see that moisture make its way northward for the event on Sunday. But sticking with Saturday, GFS here, let's take a look at the moisture return on the GFS. Should be much of the same here. That cold front stalls out. We start to see the moisture return tomorrow, and we'll have robust moisture in by Saturday morning across these regions. A little bit more aggressive is the GFS, at least with the northern extent of the moisture here in Oklahoma, a little bit farther north progression of those 60s dew points. That 60s dew point line basically from the Jowl area there, Carlsbad, up to the northeast through basically Lubbock toward Wichita Falls, Childress area up into the Kansas-Oklahoma border region. So a little bit better moisture return on the GFS. We do see perhaps a little bit of mixing here, especially out into New Mexico and West Texas there, with the dry line out in here. Perhaps some sunshine helping to mix out those dew points, some drier air aloft, mixing down to the surface, mixing out those dew points there with the 60s dew points off to the east a little bit. So very similar solution to what the NAM was showing. This is 4 p.m. Saturday and 7 p.m. Saturday. Again, not a very organized surface pattern per se out here across these regions. Dew points on the European model. Let's go down to the surface there. And much of the same. We see not quite as aggressive with the European model as far as that northward advance of moisture. So that's going to be, that could be important as well. And we see a little bit farther east, that 60s dew point line there. So a little bit of difference in where the best moisture sets up here. But overall, we might see dew points decrease out here across New Mexico, eastern New Mexico, West Texas. And then those 60s dew points might stay a little bit off to the east. Again, not a real organized surface pattern here across these regions. But we do have a moist air mass in place for Saturday. So let's take a look at some soundings here. We'll take a 4 p.m. sounding, maybe there at eastern New Mexico. Just a couple soundings here, maybe one at Lubbock as well, to kind of get an idea what the profile might look like. Decent instability here. Lapse rates aloft in the 7 degrees Celsius per kilometer range, 0 to 3 kilometer lapse rates exceeding 8 degrees Celsius per kilometer on the NAM. So nice. That is indicative of some pretty good heating. Depending on when these, if there are any more little short waves embedded in the flow, we could see rain and showers and embedded storms early on in the day. We're not quite sure on timing yet. Could see some early convection here. Might hold off till afternoon, but this particular NAM sounding does suggest that we might see some decent surface heating here to build some nice instability. Those lapse rates at the surface, again, exceeding 8 degrees Celsius per kilometer up to about 3 kilometers. Some nice lapse rates in the mid-levels leading to decent instability, upwards of 1,500 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE. It is a little bit on the skinny side, but doesn't really matter all that much here. Photographs, not all that indicative of a tornado threat. This would be more of a large hail damaging wind type sounding with very limited low-level shear and decent instability, especially in the mid-levels of the atmosphere near that freezing level, and strong deep layer shear for supercells, bulk shear in excess of 40 knots. So plenty of shear for supercells, but again, not really a tornado threat on Saturday going into the afternoon. Mostly a large hail damaging wind threat there, it looks like, at least on the NAM. This is eastern New Mexico. And much of the same going into the western Texas panhandle. This is at Lubbock. Again, kind of skinny instability, somewhat more saturated here aloft. Lapse rates not quite as steep. Maybe indicative of some antecedent convection there and some rain and showers and cloud cover, not quite allowing for real steep lapse rates aloft. But we do see surface temperatures warm a little bit there by afternoon, 70 over 62, with instability in excess of 1,600 joules per kilogram. Again, it's a little on the skinny side, so not really the most textbook sounding you want to see for robust severe weather, but certainly enough instability to support robust updrafts, but very, very limited low-level shear, and that is due to that very nebulous low-level or surface pattern. Surface winds not really all that backed, not really dealing with a surface low or low-level jet here, but plenty of shear for supercells. Actually, that shear is a little on the weaker side, 27 knots of bulk shear here. That's on the margin, so perhaps a mix of more multi-cells and maybe some embedded supercells there where the shear is strongest. Saturday looks to me like a little bit more of a messy type setup, not really all that organized in the convection. Probably a few rounds of convection, more scattered, not really all that focused convection, and a mix of multi-cells and supercells capable of isolated large hail and damaging winds. That's on the NAM. Let's take a look at the GFS here. That was at 4 p.m. Actually, let's take a look at a sounding here at Lubbock in eastern New Mexico by 7 p.m. on the NAM on Saturday, and not much has changed. As you can see, very limited low-level shear. Instability is still adequate for severe storms, but again, a little bit on the skinny side there. So that sort of holds there. Let's take a look at the GFS. We'll just take a sounding here at Lubbock at 0Z just to compare the two soundings. And the GFS is pretty much on board. Somewhat limited instability, more on the skinny side. Still plenty for robust updrafts, 1,000 to 1,100 joules per kilogram there. 7 p.m. at Lubbock on Saturday, but very limited low-level shear. Strong enough deep layer shear to support some supercells in there, but a mix of multicells and supercells with mostly a large hail threat given weak low-level shear there on Saturday. So that looks to be the case for Saturday. Let's go into Sunday. I'm going to zoom back out here and go back to 500 millibars on each of our models, and we'll start out at 0Z Sunday, so 7 p.m. Saturday, and we'll go forward into Sunday to see how the trough kind of progresses going into Sunday. So again, just broad southwesterly flow for the Saturday event out here across the central and southern high plains. Going into Sunday, we'll start to see that trough more dig down. That flow starts to approach the base of the trough here, so this trough is reaching peak maturity. And we do see somewhat stronger flow out here in the exit region of this trough. Very high amplitude trough, I must say. You can see how far south that digs, all the way into western Mexico there. So a very high amplitude trough. Most of the strongest flow still relegated to the backside of the trough, but the axis of the trough has moved east a little bit. And as such, we are going to see perhaps a little bit more forcing for storms on Sunday, although we are still a little bit removed from the axis of the trough. More still just a broad belt of southwesterly flow, not really a well-defined jet streak in here where we can do our little 4-quadrant model as we often do in these forecast videos. But we do see broad southwesterly flow across the central and southern plains. The axis of the trough, this is as far as the NAM goes. So for Monday, we're going to have to use just the GFS and Euro, but this is the 84-hour NAM here, and we do start to see it take on a little bit more of a negative tilt and start to eject into the southern high plains here, but mostly still just broad southwesterly flow, stronger than the previous day, but still just kind of a broad belt of southwesterly flow for our event on Sunday. So that is 0Z Monday, so 7 p.m. Sunday. On the NAM, let's take a look at the GFS. GFS, much of the same here. And so very similar looking solution on both of these models. A little bit more of perhaps a well-defined jet streak here. We could call this a little bit more of a jet streak, a little bit more curvature here. So this could be a nice defined shortwave to help us focus that severe weather threat across maybe western Oklahoma, southern Kansas, or western to southwest Kansas as well, out ahead of that little shortwave trough there, perhaps a little shortwave embedded in the flow. NAM kind of has the same thing as well, a little bit of curvature in there, so that might mean just out ahead of that we could see the severe threat focus right there. But very similar solutions among these two models. European model, let's take a look at how it handles this trough as well, and a very similar looking solution here to the GFS and the NAM. So we're seeing very good model agreement among these three models at this range. We're still 3 to 4 days out, so that is pretty good agreement for this range. So the forecast is fairly high confidence forecast so far for this setup. European model maybe a little bit more on the neutrally tilted side, GFS and NAM a little bit more on the negatively tilted side overall for this trough, but fairly negligible difference there at this point. We'll see what the GFS and Euro have for Monday's event, but for now, very similar solution, perhaps a little bit of a shortwave developing here across the southern high plains and stronger flow out ahead of that, and the severe threat looks to focus there, Kansas into Oklahoma, perhaps all the way up into Nebraska as well. But we'll have to just wait and see and iron out the details a little bit more as the short-range models come into range. But very similar solution there. Let's take a look at the surface and see how the surface is handled here. So going back to 0Z, 7 p.m. Saturday. Again, fairly quiescent surface pattern, not really a focused surface pattern here. As we go into Sunday, I would suspect we start to see a little bit more cyclogenesis here, given a little bit more focused shortwave moving into the southern high plains, and that's exactly what we get. We see nice surface low development out here across eastern and southeast Colorado to really focus perhaps a little bit better the severe threat across the central and southern plains. Nice southerly flow out ahead of that would likely be a very defined dry line here, given a little bit stronger low-level flow, a little bit tighter of a gradient there at the surface, but a nice, much more defined surface low than what we'll see on Saturday on Sunday. GFS at the surface. Let's take a look at how it handles the surface here. So this is 7 p.m. Saturday. Going forward, we don't see much in the way until Sunday afternoon. We see very nice surface low development out there in southeast Colorado. So this is a very classic location, classic progression of the surface pattern for a typical central to southern plains severe weather event. So definitely from a storm chasing severe weather forecast perspective, I'm liking what I'm seeing for severe weather on Sunday, at least from a background pattern perspective with that surface low, much better defined surface low there in eastern Colorado. European model here, I bet it's going to show much of the same since it handled the 500 millibar pattern pretty well as well. Maybe not quite as defined of a surface low, but still a nice surface low developing there across southeast Colorado. Similar progression to what we see on the other models, maybe not quite as defined as what we see on the NAM and GFS, but that could be just a European model kink there. European model does keep temperatures cool out here across this region. That is something to keep an eye on. Temperatures only warm into the mid to upper 60s out here across the entire risk area, it seems. Northern Texas into Oklahoma, Kansas into Nebraska, whereas we do see nice warming on the GFS, temperatures into the 70s here across the central and southern plains, as well as we see that on the NAM. We know the NAM tends to have the cool bias there, so the European model could be picking up on some antecedent precipitation or cloud cover, so that'll be something we have to watch, especially with any convection that persists overnight into the morning from Saturday into Sunday. How about our moisture here? Let's go back to Saturday evening on the NAM. We'll zoom into our Central Plains sector here. Actually, we'll go to our Southern Plains sector here. So our 60s dew points continue to move their way to the north, and we should see rapid moisture advection off to the north. Once that surface low really gets going out here across southeast Colorado, we'll start to see those surface winds back and strengthen pretty considerably and really start to pump that moisture northward. You can see what it's done to the dry line as well. As we suspected, a much tighter, well-defined dry line than what we saw the previous day on Saturday, because we have that nice, well-defined surface low to really tighten that gradient at the surface. Dew points in the low to mid and even upper 60s here across the Red River region northward. Robust dew points all the way off to the north. Let's see how far north they go. And we have 60s dew points all the way up into southeast Nebraska. That's plenty of moisture for this time of year. A little bit less, a little more diffuse dry line up to the north. We do see a nice gradient here, but we do see kind of that what we saw on Saturday. A little bit of kind of a dual gradient here between the 50s and 60s, and then the dry air to the west where our actual synoptic dry line is. But to the south, much tighter dry line. That could be something to watch as well here for a perhaps slightly greater threat across the southern plains. GFS, moisture. Let's go back here, and we'll zoom into our southern plains sector first. So again, the GFS was the most aggressive of the three models, with the moisture return having the 60s dew point line very far to the north by Saturday evening. That continues. Nice moisture advection here. Well-defined dry line by Saturday afternoon and evening. Very tight dry line here. Close to the Texas-Oklahoma border down into the kind of Del Rio region, the border region there of West Texas, all the way up into Kansas. Let's take a look here on our Central Plains sector, that nice moisture all the way up into southeast Nebraska and southern Iowa as well. So a broad area of robust low-level moisture here. Of course, stronger dew points down to the south, not all that surprising. It's closer to the moisture source, but a nice tight dry line down here for this particular setup. European model. So here is the European model, starting in the southern plains, and once again we see that dry line really start to tighten up by Sunday afternoon, especially down here in the southern plains. Very similar location among these three models of where that feature sets up. Much more diffuse on the European model up here, but those 60s dew points are relegated a little bit farther off to the east, but still very similar progression to what we saw with the other two models. So let's take some soundings here. This is at 4 p.m. on Sunday, very far west. It was, as we recall here, the day 4 outlook. Actually, that's pretty good. I thought, from memory, it was a little bit farther east, but this is a pretty good look. So that is where our severe weather threat area is going to be, east of that dry line. And so let's take a couple soundings here. We'll take one in northwest Texas ahead of what appears to be a little bit of a dry line bulge right here. We always like to target the dry line bulges, a little bit stronger shear, a little bit stronger convergence along those dry line bulges to perhaps focus severe storm development here. maybe one up here into northwest Oklahoma, and one up here into kind of central Kansas. So this is at 4 p.m. Sunday. Instability is on the weaker side, which is something to note for sure. That is definitely a little bit surprising. This could be a lot of cloud cover and perhaps antecedent showers through the morning and early afternoon hours on Sunday. The NAM is usually fairly robust with the instability, fairly bullish on the instability. Not the case here. Very limited instability. We do have some steeper lapse rates aloft, but very skinny instability profiles here. So we'll have to watch that for sure. We've talked about it before. We don't need a ton of instability in these cool season setups because the shear is usually very strong, and that can help overcome. You can still get low-topped supercells with all hazards here, but that is something to watch. The NAM, which is usually the more bullish model with instability, certainly on the weaker side here with more skinny, more meager cape profiles there. So this again is in northwest Texas. The wind profile also a little bit wonky. We do see a little bit of that sort of M-shaped signature there with a little bit of veer signature in the low to mid levels of the atmosphere. You can see it in the winds here. We kind of veer and then we kind of go back. A little bit of backing there right around 800 to 700 millibars. So we've talked about this before. A lot of times this doesn't matter. If you can sustain discrete supercell development in an environment with veer, it doesn't matter all that much. Can have some impacts on the persistence and duration of mesocyclones. And I usually have found that the lower this kink is in the hodograph in the atmosphere, the more impact it has, more of a negative impact it has. It is pretty low in the atmosphere, but we do see some nice curvature below that. I wouldn't worry too much about that right now. This could also mean a little bit of a shortwave passage early on Sunday. And I'll go back here to 700 millibars. Just going to take a look at the NAM real quick. We could be dealing with a little bit of an early shortwave passage. This is a lot of times what instigates this sort of veer signature. And we do see Sunday morning a little bit of a wave in here, perhaps moving across Oklahoma. And behind that, we have a little bit of a void in the winds. So that could be something to note there. We may have a little bit of an early shortwave passage. So this would make sense. So this is 21Z. I pulled the sounding from right in here, kind of on the back side of this shortwave. And so that would make sense with a little bit weaker flow here just behind the shortwave. This may mean the severe threat might be focused a little bit more ahead of that. I wonder if the Oklahoma sounding we pulled is a little bit less. No, it still has that kink in it. That is interesting to note. So all in all, wind profiles definitely favor supercells, strong deep layer shear in excess of 45 knots with fairly decent low-level shear. Not a ton of low-level shear, but plenty of veering with height in the lowest levels of the atmosphere. But we'll have to watch that for sure, as that could mean, could have some implications on the overall development and progression of storms on Sunday. Here we are in western to northwest Oklahoma. A little bit better instability up here, a little bit fatter instability profile, especially in the mid-levels. About 1,000 to 1,100 joules per kilogram mixed layer cape. Steep lapse rates aloft. This would favor more low-topped supercells here. A little bit stronger low-level shear, closer to the surface low. So that would mean an all-hazards threat would be a little bit more likely with any supercells here out in western Oklahoma. We do still see that kink, though. It is pretty high up in the atmosphere here. We do see a little bit more backing, a little bit higher up, closer to that 600 millibar level or so. So that probably wouldn't have as much of an impact up here in Oklahoma. Still plenty of, again, strong deep layer and low-level shear with better instability up here. So that might tell us that the severe threat might be a little bit better focused across western Oklahoma, where the overall environment is a little bit better come Sunday afternoon. Up into Kansas, thermodynamics not quite as good up here into, actually, where did we pull this from? This was up into kind of north-central Kansas there. So not quite as good thermodynamics there at all. Some stronger capping. Again, this could be a NAM issue here with temperatures remaining in the 60s. Wind profile is not quite as strong up here as well. So it looks like that sweet spot might end up being, at least on the NAM here, might end up being in that western Oklahoma to southwest Kansas corridor, just ahead of this shortwave by Sunday afternoon. Let's take a look at the GFS here. We'll take a couple of the same soundings. We'll take some NAM soundings at 0Z as well. So that was 21Z, 4 p.m. This is at 0Z, right ahead of the dry line bulge there, northwest Texas, maybe one into northwest Oklahoma. And then up in Kansas, looks a little bit messy as well. Could be some convection ongoing there. And then we'll take some of the same soundings here across the area. So northwest Texas, western Oklahoma, and then one up into north central to central Kansas. So here we are, northwest Texas. Again, instability on the weaker side, some drier air aloft. So if supercells can sustain, would be perhaps a little bit better chance to be more isolated in nature with some drier air, maybe a little bit more structure here. Nice curvature there in the low levels of the atmosphere, but again, we see that weakness, that pretty decent backing of the winds in the low to mid levels of the atmosphere there. But still, if we can sustain supercells, that wouldn't be too much of an issue. Oklahoma, it's even worse here. Man, this instability is just not all that great. So we're going to have to watch that definitely for sure. And then Kansas, of course, now on the NAM by Sunday evening with the better looking profiles as the instability shifted up here for sure on the NAM with better low level shear. So that would favor an all hazards threat. That was up into central Kansas. So a little bit all over the place on the NAM runs at this point. Again, this is just one model run a few days out, so I don't want to look too much into the fine scale details of the setup. But overall, it looks like instability. We're going to have to watch how that plays out. Could be a concern here in perhaps negating the severe weather threat if lower instability and these kind of very skinny instability profiles come to fruition. But if we can get enough instability, certainly favorable, the environment will be favorable for supercells with strong deep layer shear, and perhaps that all hazards threat with some low-level shear in play as well. GFS here looking not all that great. You can see here in Texas, very straight photographs there, limited instability, but enough to support low-top supercells. Oklahoma there, this is in west central Oklahoma, so would favor that all hazards threat with more low top supercells with some curvature and enough instability to support robust updrafts. And same thing up there into Kansas, a little bit better instability up in Kansas, which was what the NAM was showing by Sunday evening. So again, don't want to look too much into the fine scale details there for Sunday, but it looks like we could see that all hazards threat develop from Kansas, particularly from Kansas down into Oklahoma, ahead of that developing surface low and dry line across the central and southern plains. Let's look now at Monday's threat. Again, the NAM doesn't go out any farther than this, so I'm going to back out on the GFS and the European model to take a look at Monday real quick. This is the farthest out the outlook, an outlook has been drawn, so don't want to go too much into the details here for Monday, but we'll just take a look at the broad scale details of the setup. Trough finally does start to eject into the plains, and we see that flow really start to wrap around the base of this trough. This means that the trough has reached peak intensity, and it definitely kind of becomes more compact as we go into the day on Monday. A nice little wave in here with a very strong jet streak rounding the base of this trough. Maybe a little bit of a short wave in here as well. So this looks like this is a little bit more of a favorable look, at least at the 500 millibar level with this trough, than what we saw for the previous couple of days. So Monday's for sure going to have to be watched here. European model shows much of the same. Nice kind of negatively tilted little short wave in here. This went one too far. This is 0Z, so 7 p.m. Monday. But, sorry, this is going to be 6 p.m. Monday because daylight savings is on Sunday. I forgot about that. So this is going to be 6 p.m. Central Standard Time on Monday. Excuse me, I've messed up the times all a bit in this video, but basically the time frame, this is evening on Monday. Nice little sort of negatively tilted shortwave there. Nice little jet streak, putting the exit regions right there across eastern half of Kansas into central and eastern Oklahoma. So that may be our focused area for severe weather there. According to these two models, very similar solutions among the models as well. Surface low traverses off to the east overnight Monday into Tuesday, or excuse me, Sunday into Monday. Nice surface low there in eastern Kansas, and I like to see that this for a severe threat, especially up there in Kansas. Winds are more backed up there. You have the surface low to provide a little bit of extra juice for severe storms out in that area, and I'm sure the European model shows much of the same. A little bit more strung out surface low on the European model, a little bit more of a banana low, as we like to colloquially say in the storm chasing community. But overall, we do have a nice surface low there impinging upon the central plains, and moisture should maintain itself as well up into these areas. Should the ingredients are there for a continued severe weather threat going into Monday evening ahead of that surface low. Nice little triple point even on the European model there. Take a couple of quick soundings out across this region. Don't really trust the GFS as far as instability goes this far out. but we'll just take a few soundings here near the surface low, just to see the overall wind profiles here. Don't pay too much attention to the instability. It'll probably be stronger than this, but that certainly is a hodograph that would favor some severe weather. Very strong speed shear here. Again, still have that backing in the mid-levels of the atmosphere, but wouldn't have too much of an issue in this particular setup. Down in Oklahoma, that's not something that looks favorable for severe weather, but up in Kansas, certainly this would be a favorable environment for severe storms, especially if instability is stronger than forecast, which it usually is compared to what the GFS shows. So that is going to be it for these next 3 days that have been outlined so far. Just a quick look beyond Monday. The trough does start to eject into the Midwest, kind of flattens out a little bit. It's definitely past its peak there with very much lower amplitude features, strong winds aloft. Not sure if this would favor a robust severe weather threat, maybe more of a sort of a squall line type threat. Don't want to speculate too much at this point as we have some uncertainty in how this is going to progress. We need to watch how this trough progresses before we can make judgments on that. European model, though, showing kind of the same solution. Not all that favorable of a look for robust severe weather, maybe more of a squall line with some marginally severe winds in there. And we have another trough on the backside that starts to dig down on the GFS. We'll have to watch that for sure for severe weather beyond this next little stretch, perhaps toward the end of next week. European model shows much of the same, little bit of a cutoff low that starts to develop there and sits across the southern plains. So that we'll have to watch for sure. Could be some more severe weather towards the end of next week. But for now, that's what we have going on for this upcoming stretch, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. So going back to our outlooks here, again, slight risks out from the SPC for all 3 of those days. Starting Saturday, West Texas with a marginal risk surrounding that up into Kansas, western Oklahoma, and into central Texas. Again, not really looking at a super organized threat on Sunday. It looks like at this point, or on Saturday at this point, looks like more of a more scattered kind of disorganized severe threat, but we do have enough ingredients in place for some severe storms here. Marginally severe hail, marginally severe wind gusts. Tornado threat appears very low on Saturday, with this slight risk, but we could see some severe storms out of that. More robust day looks to be Sunday. SPC has outlined a risk all the way from central Nebraska southward into North Texas. Again, perhaps focusing a little bit more on that Kansas to Oklahoma corridor ahead of the developing surface low in southeast Colorado and the dry line, which is we have much better surface features for Sunday. A little bit of a wonky wind profile. We'll have to see how that plays out, and instability is of concern. Might not have a lot of instability to work with, and we'll see what the reasons for that are as we get closer to the event. But certainly, if instability is there, strong wind shear would favor severe storms with a large hail and damaging wind risk and maybe a tornado threat as well. And then going into Monday, that threat shifts off to the east a little bit. Surface low shifts off to the east as well, with that threat continuing for Kansas down through Oklahoma, eastern Oklahoma, and northeast Texas as well. And then beyond that, we could see some severe weather risks added in future outlooks, and perhaps another trough coming in toward late next week. But that is what we have to work with for now. I'll be back with additional videos as these severe threats come to fruition and we get closer to the actual days here. Again, along with these severe threat, heavy rain is on the table as well, starting tomorrow across southeast New Mexico and moving off to the east progressively through the next several days, and really peaking on that Sunday to Monday morning time frame across Oklahoma into southeast Kansas, where we have a level 3 out of 4 moderate risk for excessive rainfall and flash flooding in that area. So lots of folks going to get some beneficial rain, but that could come with some flash flooding as well. And then we go into early next week. That flood threat continues moving off to the northeast. So folks in these areas from the southern high plains northeastward into the central plains and even the Midwest need to keep an eye out on keep an eye on the forecast over the coming days, as it does look to continue. We do look to continue this active stretch of severe weather through at least the early portion of next week. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.